I've told this story maybe 5 or 6 times over the years, but it took me about 15 years into my career to have the courage to share it. And every time I tell it with a different purpose in mind. But each time I tell it, it begins, as I made my way up to his third-floor office, so many thoughts danced about my mind. A few days earlier, he left a note in my school mailbox. Michael, I'd like to meet with you Monday morning at 10. As I energetically bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, I was curious, a bit nervous, but mostly excited, wondering what he wanted. Slightly winded, I was badly out of shape back then. I took a moment to catch my breath before I knocked on the open door. He beckoned me in, pointed to a chair in front of his desk, and every time I'd been in that office, I was filled with awe. He was a world-famous scholar. I was lucky to be one of his students. His office was crammed, filled with shelves of books. His desk was piled high with magazines and articles. And I dreamt that one day I would have an office just like his. For the past 4 years, Dr. Hiller had been one of my main professors at Johns Hopkins. I was a graduate student in an ancient Semitic studies program. We learned and read ancient languages like Hebrew and Akkadian, Ugaritic, Aramaic, and Syriac. We read stuff written thousands of years ago, the oldest things humans ever penned. They were scribbled on rocks and walls and caves, and I loved it. And I knew in a few years I was going to be a professor. A month earlier, I passed my comprehensive exams, 4 8-hour days, exams covering everything in the ancient world. I went from being a PhD student to a PhD candidate. I'd started my dissertation. Another 1.5 years, I would be Dr. Graham. Don't you like how that sounds? Dr. Graham. Dr. Black Welders? All of those thoughts danced about my mind as I sat in the chair. I already had my tweed jackets and my pipes picked out. Now, my professor wasn't one to fool around. I'd taken about 10 classes over the years with him. He was all business. These classes only had 2 or 3 students in them. He never once cracked a joke. Normally, in our classes, when they were that small, the professor was warm and fuzzy and friendly, but not Dr. Hiller. I never once heard him laugh. No sooner had I taken my seat, filled with curiosity, than he got to the point. I don't want you to finish the program. Now, it had been 3 days since Dr. Hiller scheduled this meeting. And in those 3 days, I imagined dozens of different conversations, but never this one. I don't want you to finish the program. And then he added, with a little twist, I was kind of hoping you would have flunked your comprehensives so it wouldn't come to this. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there, stunned and hurt, and horribly embarrassed. Finally, he broke the uncomfortable silence and said, "Certainly, you could get a job in a church." Truth was, I don't want to work in a church. I wanted to work in a university, not an intellectually stifling environment like a church. I didn't know there were churches like this. I just sat there and didn't say anything. And then a moment later, I said, "Okay." And I got up and left. I was too numb to even ask, why? Why do you feel this way? What did I do or what didn't I do? I spent the next couple of hours driving around Baltimore in a daze. I'd spent the last 4 years going to class every single day, going to work at UPS at night, working the midnight shift. Cindy had made great sacrifices, so too our 3 children. I continued to drive, too embarrassed to go home, haunted by what had happened, worrying, what in the world will I do? What will my next step be? At that point in my life, I had spent the last 7 years of my life in graduate school, first seminary, then Johns Hopkins. It never once during those 7 years did it occur to me that I might not one day be a professor. Now what? Perhaps a strange way to start a Christmas sermon. For when most of us think about Christmas, we're filled with happy thoughts, silent, holy nights. Christmas is a time for pleasant memories from our childhood to revisit us. Memories of Christmases past, the excitement and wonder of tomorrow morning. We think of families gathered around trees filled with presents and later sharing a wonderful meal. That's what Christmas is, but that is only part of the story. For that first Christmas began on a different note, one that's a little bit discordant, unsettled. Christmas may end with joy to the world, but it begins in the midst of the bleak midwinter. And if we enter the story that we heard this morning and we set our cynical sides aside, what we meet will usher us into all the angst anyone could ever experience. A young girl, maybe 12 or 13, has discovered that she's with child. Her yes to God has turned her world upside down. What would Joseph say? How about mom and dad? What would people say about this young, engaged, but oh so pregnant child? So upset, so worried, so confused, and perhaps filled with a little bit of shame. She does something almost unthinkable. It continues after verse 38. But she runs away. She leaves her home, her past, her people. In haste, the story tells us, she made an 80-mile trek to the home of her Aunt Elizabeth. Hard to imagine, isn't it? A young teenage girl, 80 miles. It would have probably taken her 4 days. Where would she have stayed? What thoughts must have haunted her during those long, dark nights? But when she arrives at Aunt Elizabeth's house, she is received not with 1 ounce of judgment, not with scorn or doubt. Aunt Lizzie doesn't wag her finger, speaks no incriminating words. Nothing like, how in the world could you have done that? What were you thinking? You want me to believe that? None of that. Elizabeth speaks these words, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." I imagine that when Mary heard those words, they helped heal a broken spirit. Blessed are you among women. Certainly that's not what a lot of people would have thought. Blessed for to be pregnant and unmarried. In the world Mary grew up meant she was cursed. She could be stoned by the righteous men of Nazareth. I close my eyes and I see a terrified teenage girl. And then I hear the healing words of her aunt. Thanks be that there are people like Elizabeth in our world who speak words of hope and healing when we need it most, who believe in us when we don't believe in ourselves, who embrace and affirm and reassure us, bringing us back to ourselves and to life, empowering us to take the next necessary step. When I read the story, I sometimes wonder, what if Elizabeth scolds Mary? What if she says, "How dare you?" Perhaps all of human history from that moment goes in a different direction. We'll never know. But 3 months later, Mary is healed and she returns home. She does so, at least in my mind, a different person, ready to face whatever challenges life offers her. After driving around Baltimore for hours, I went home, sat in my car in the driveway. Eventually, Cindy came out. Probably the toughest conversation I ever had with her. But she couldn't have been more supportive. We'll figure this out together. You'll be fine. We'll be fine. She was Elizabeth. In a world filled with so much pain and hatred, I hope that the Guilford Community Church is a place filled with Elizabeths, a church of great acceptance and affirmation, better at hugging than hating. I know Cindy's better at hugging. I'll have to work on that. A church that has the power to rewrite your story. I hope that, because in all likelihood, someone here this morning needs your story rewritten. You need not a lecture, but a loving. So if you are troubled like Mary was, or like I was, or like many of us have been, I hope that you will encounter sooner than later someone like Elizabeth or Cindy. And then discover the courage that Mary did, the courage I eventually discovered, the courage to be open and honest, to share life's embarrassing moments. For shame's only power is secrecy and silence. And there is freedom in healing and coming out and opening up. And perhaps, if we do that, perhaps God might be born in our world once again. Amen. And now please stand as we close this service, singing hymn number 128, "In the Bleak Midwinter."